What I see in Israel refusing $38 billion from the United States is not generosity, and it is not defiance. It is a signal, precisely calibrated, deliberately timed, and addressed to a very specific audience. That audience is not Iran, not Hamas, not the Arab world, not the International Criminal Court. That audience is Washington. When the state that has received more American foreign assistance than any other country in recorded history, more than any European ally rebuilt after World War II, more than any Asian partner maintained across the Cold War. When that state refuses to take the next installment, it is not making a financial calculation. It is making a power calculation. And that calculation reads like this: the patron's money is now worth less than the message that comes with refusing it. Most people covering this story are working from one of two frames. Frame 1. Israel is finally standing on its own, principled, independent, a mature state asserting sovereignty from a patron it has outgrown. Frame 2. Israel is overreaching, biting the hand that built it, gambling its diplomatic protection on a question of pride. Both frames are wrong. What this refusal actually represents, when you trace it through 70 years of financial architecture, through the specific mechanism by which American leverage in the Middle East was constructed, and through the historical cases where a client state crossed this precise threshold before, is the beginning of something that has no clean diplomatic name. Strategists who study these relationships call it patron-client inversion. History is very clear about what inversion produces. Not immediately, not loudly, but with a structural certainty that makes every number that follows worth your full attention. Here is the anchor number: $158 billion. That is the total cumulative value of U.S. assistance, military and economic, provided to Israel since its founding in 1948, according to the Congressional Research Service's 2024 report. Adjusted to today's dollars, it is the largest aid transfer to any single country in American history. Larger than what the Marshall Plan contributed to any individual European nation. Larger than anything the United States has ever transferred to a single Asian, African, or Latin American partner. Now here is the layer underneath that number that most analysis never reaches. In 1973, American military aid represented more than 30% of Israel's total defense budget. As of 2023, it represents approximately 16%. In 1973, Israel could not resupply its military without American logistics. Today, Israel is a top 10 global arms exporter, generating more than $12 billion in annual defense export revenue, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute's 2023 data, and selling to 43 countries. The patron built the client. The client built itself into something the patron no longer controls. The $38 billion refusal is the moment that transformation became impossible to ignore. By the end of this analysis, you will understand this relationship more precisely than 95% of people consuming daily coverage. And you will understand exactly what this refusal is designed to accomplish, and why the answer concerns you regardless of your politics. To understand the refusal, you have to understand what was being built, and why. The modern U.S.-Israel security relationship did not begin with American generosity. It began with a crisis. In October 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated surprise attack on Israeli positions in the Sinai and the Golan Heights. In the first 72 hours, Israel lost aircraft, tanks, and territory at a pace its own commanders had not anticipated. President Nixon ordered Operation Nickelgrass, the largest American military airlift since the Berlin blockade. Over 32 days, the United States delivered 22,325 tons of equipment to Israel, according to the U.S. Air Force Historical Research Agency. Tanks, aircraft, precision munitions. The airlift turned the military situation. But it also created something neither government formally announced: a structural dependency. Israel had survived because America chose to intervene. Both governments understood the terms of what that created, and both governments spent the next 50 years building on that understanding in ways that are now producing a consequence neither of them modeled correctly at the start. Because here is the specific thing that neither side accounted for, and the person who identified it most precisely said something that deserves very close attention. Martin Indyk, former U.S. ambassador to Israel, former Middle East peace negotiator, senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, argued in a 2021 analysis that America's ability to direct Israeli policy had entered what he called irreversible erosion. That is the diplomatic phrasing. What it actually means for the $38 billion, and for the leverage that money was always supposed to represent, is the conclusion that changes everything else in this story. What neither side modeled correctly was the exit. The mechanism that created Israeli dependency was military aid. The mechanism that ended it was what that aid produced. Here is exactly how it worked, because the sequence matters. Every American weapon system that arrived in Israel, every F-16, every Patriot battery, every precision-guided munition, came with engineering problems that Israeli defense contractors were paid to solve. Over decades, solving those problems produced intellectual property, patents, manufacturing capabilities, defense systems that Israel designed, built, and then sold internationally. The aid arrived as equipment. It left as expertise. The Iron Dome is the clearest single case. Developed between 2011 and 2021 with approximately $1.4 billion in U.S. congressional funding, according to the Congressional Research Service, the Iron Dome was built as an Israeli system, with Israeli specifications, Israeli software, and Israeli manufacturing. In 2019, the United States Army purchased 2 Iron Dome batteries for $373 million. The client had sold the technology directly back to the patron. The second mechanism was intelligence. Israel's Unit 8200, its Signals Intelligence Directorate, is assessed by Western intelligence agencies as operating at a peer level with the NSA, not junior partner, peer. The Unit 8200 alumni network has built more than 1,000 technology companies, including CyberArk, Checkpoint Software, and Waze, dozens of which are now embedded in American financial infrastructure, telecommunications networks, and government contracting supply chains. The intelligence relationship has become genuinely bidirectional. In specific domains, the critical information flow now runs as heavily from Tel Aviv to Washington as it does in the other direction. The third mechanism was political architecture. The American Israel Public Affairs Committee spent approximately $100 million influencing the 2024 U.S. election cycle, according to Open Secrets tracking data. That figure represents more political spending than the annual GDP of several sovereign nations. No American president, regardless of party, enters office with a free hand on Israel policy. That is not an opinion. It is a structural feature of the political system built over 50 years, which now operates independently of any single administration's preferences. These three mechanisms together, technological self-sufficiency, intelligence peer status, political infrastructure, are precisely what created the conditions for the refusal. The $38 billion is not being rejected because Israel does not need money. It is being rejected because the political cost of accepting it on American terms, the conditions, the oversight, the implicit public acknowledgement of dependency, now exceeds the financial value of the money itself. David Makovsky, senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, put the structural shift this way in a February 2025 analysis. When a state can credibly walk away from aid, the nature of the relationship has fundamentally changed. The question is no longer what the patron will provide. The question is what the patron must offer to remain relevant. Read that sentence a second time, because it describes something that has not been true at any previous point in the 70-year history of this relationship. Here is where American foreign policy and your tax dollars enter this story directly. The United States maintains what foreign policy analysts call a leverage architecture across its entire global security network. The mechanism is consistent. Military and economic dependency creates political compliance. The partner needs the weapons, the money, the diplomatic protection at the United Nations, and so the partner accepts American conditions, American preferences on elections, on trade, on regional alignment. That is the operating logic. This mechanism is the structural foundation of American influence in Europe, East Asia, the Gulf states, and across Latin America. It is not hidden. The United States maintains 750 military bases in 80 countries and spends more on its military annually than the next 9 countries combined, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute's 2024 Global Defense Spending Report. That scale of presence is sustained by the leverage architecture. Now watch what happens when one member of that network publicly demonstrates it has escaped. Every government watching this refusal, from Riyadh, from Seoul, from Warsaw, from Ankara, is running the same internal calculation. What would it take for us to reach that threshold? What would it take to be in a position where we could decline American money without absorbing consequences? Because if Israel can do it, the state that has been more structurally dependent on American support than any other in the post-war era, then the precedent has been established. And precedents, once established, do not remain contained. The Congressional Budget Office issued a significant warning in its March 2025 Foreign Assistance Review. The report noted that the effectiveness of security assistance as a tool of diplomatic leverage has declined measurably across multiple partner states over the past decade, as defense industrial capacity and alternative financing sources have expanded globally. Bureaucratic language for the tool is breaking, and the $38 billion refusal is the most visible fracture yet. For the average American taxpayer, the implications are direct. The United States spends approximately $50 billion per year on foreign military assistance across all partners. If that assistance is becoming systematically less effective as a compliance mechanism, if partners are increasingly capable of declining it without consequence, then the strategic return on that investment is declining in ways that have not been disclosed publicly. This is where your country's global position enters the story. Not abstractly, concretely. Every alliance maintained through financial leverage that loses its leverage becomes an alliance that must be maintained through other means, through compromise, through political accommodation, or simply through the uncomfortable acknowledgement that the partner now operates on its own terms. The $38 billion is not the end of that story. It is the opening chapter. Now take a careful breath, because here is where the three threads, the leverage architecture, the patron-client inversion, and what history has consistently shown about where this pattern ends, converge into a conclusion that no analyst in mainstream coverage has been willing to state plainly. Every student of imperial history knows this pattern, and the most precise historical parallel is not drawn from the Middle East. It is drawn from Britain's relationship with the United States in the 1940s. In 1944, Britain arrived at the Bretton Woods Conference as the world's dominant financial power, anchor of the global reserve currency, patron of an empire spanning every continent. The United States arrived as Britain's largest creditor, the country that had provided $31 billion in Lend-Lease wartime support and was now positioned to set the terms of the post-war financial order. Britain did not lose the Bretton Woods Conference in a single dramatic moment. The transfer of financial supremacy from the pound to the dollar was not announced. It was not negotiated as one event. It accumulated through individual transactions, individual refusals, individual American assertions of preference, until the structural shift was irreversible, and the patron had become the client. The pattern historians identified in Britain's experience is precisely what is now visible in America's relationship with Israel. The patron continues to believe the relationship is stable long after the client has privately concluded it is optional. Strategic analysts at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a nonpartisan foreign policy research institution, published a scenario modeling paper in January 2025 assessing three trajectories for the U.S.-Israel relationship across the next decade. Scenario 1, recalibrated partnership, probability 35 to 40%. Both sides acknowledge the changed leverage dynamic, renegotiate the relationship on mutual interest terms rather than dependency terms, and construct a new framework. Diplomatically difficult, but structurally stable. The relationship continues, transformed, not broken. Scenario 2, managed divergence. Probability, 40 to 45%. Israel continues operating with increasing autonomy on regional policy. Gaza reconstruction terms, West Bank developments, normalization timelines, while maintaining the formal appearance of American alignment. Washington preserves the optics of partnership. Israel retains operational freedom. The relationship becomes performance rather than partnership. Scenario 3, structural rupture. Probability, 15 to 20%. A specific trigger, an Israeli decision that directly contradicts a stated American red line, combined with a moment of domestic American political pressure that cannot be absorbed, causes the divergence to become public and irrecoverable. Formal relations continue, but the security architecture fractures. The Quincy Institute's researchers documented the same finding that appears in every analysis of patron-client inversion. Historical cases, without exception, produced outcomes more severe than either side modeled at the moment the inversion began. Not occasionally. In every documented case. Now, the gap narrative, because it matters. The official American position is that the U.S.-Israel relationship is a cornerstone of Middle East stability, a partnership of shared democratic values, mutual security interests, and enduring solidarity. That position is stated in every State Department briefing and every joint press statement. The observable record is different. American weapons transfers to Israel were partially paused in 2024 by the Biden administration, then reinstated, then paused again, in a pattern that signals internal American ambiguity rather than coherent policy. The United States abstained on a United Nations Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza in March 2024, breaking a decade-long pattern of unqualified American vetoes on Israel-related resolutions. And now the $38 billion refusal, a move that a genuine dependent state in a genuinely functional patron-client relationship would not be positioned to make. Each of these moments is individually explicable. Together, they describe a gap between the announced stability of the alliance and its actual operational state. That gap, between the performance of the relationship and its structural reality, is not a messaging problem. It is evidence that the relationship is already being renegotiated, whether both governments acknowledge it publicly or not. Before the final section, something deserves a full stop. Behind every number in this analysis, behind the $158 billion in cumulative aid, the $12 billion in annual arms exports, the $100 million in political spending, there are people who are not statistics. Palestinians across Gaza, where the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs estimated in March 2025 that more than 90% of the population had been displaced at least once since October 2023. Israelis who have lived under genuine, documented security threat for their entire lives, not as an abstraction, but as a daily operational reality. American soldiers and diplomats who will manage consequences of a relationship neither government has described accurately to its own public. The structural analysis is necessary, but it is the people, not the architecture, who absorb the consequences when the architecture fails. Those people sit behind every number in this conversation. Step back from the three scenarios for a moment, because here is what all of this, the leverage collapse, the patron-client inversion, the gap between official narrative and observable reality, actually means for American influence globally. And the answer points in one direction only. What I want you to take from this is not alarm, and it is not a conclusion about whether Israel's decision was right or wrong. That is a political question, and political questions carry political answers that depend entirely on where you sit. What is useful is the structural map. Now, I want to give the counter-argument its full weight, because serious analysts with serious credentials look at everything laid out here and arrive somewhere considerably calmer. And they are not wrong to do so. Their argument is this: Israel still depends on the United States in ways that cannot be priced in dollars. The U.S. has exercised its veto at the United Nations Security Council on Israel-related resolutions more than 40 times since 1972, according to UN records. No amount of Iron Dome exports, no Unit 8200 capabilities, and no political spending replaces that diplomatic protection. Without American cover at the Security Council, Israel faces potential exposure under international humanitarian law that would be existentially consequential, in ways that money cannot solve and weapons cannot prevent. The $38 billion refusal, the counter-argument continues, is a negotiating signal, not a declaration of independence. Israel's economy remains deeply integrated with American capital markets, American venture investment, and American technology partnerships. Declining one specific aid package is a recalibration within the American system, not an exit from it. That argument has real weight. American diplomatic protection at the United Nations is structural, ongoing, and not replicable through any other mechanism Israel currently has access to. It is the dimension of the relationship where leverage clearly still runs from Washington to Tel Aviv, not the reverse. The honest picture, stripped of both the triumphalism and the alarm, is this: Israel has achieved genuine independence in the economic and military dimensions of the relationship. It has not achieved independence in the diplomatic and legal dimensions. The $38 billion refusal is possible because one category of dependency has been resolved. The other category remains binding, and both sides understand that clearly. What that means in practice? Israel can operate with considerably more autonomy on the ground, on reconstruction terms, on settlement decisions, on the pace of regional normalization, than at any previous point in the relationship. But it still requires American protection against the international legal architecture that would otherwise impose binding consequences. That protection is the remaining card, and Washington knows it. Here is what to watch. Watch the United Nations Security Council veto pattern. If the United States moves from unqualified vetoes to abstentions on resolutions related to Israeli settlement activity, as it did once in March 2024, that is Washington beginning to exercise the one leverage point it still retains. One abstention is a signal. A pattern of abstentions is a structural shift. Watch Israel's defense export revenue trajectory. If it exceeds $15 billion in 2025, up from $12 billion in 2023 per SIPRI data, the financial independence is accelerating, not plateauing. The trajectory of that number tells you more about where this relationship is heading than any official statement from either capital. Watch the terms of any Saudi-Israel normalization framework. If the deal requires significant Israeli concessions on Palestinian statehood as a Saudi condition, American leverage still exists in a meaningful and operative form. If the deal proceeds on Israeli terms, without those concessions, it does not. Those three signals will tell you more about the actual state of this relationship than a year of press conferences. The people who understand power, not as a narrative, not as a feeling, but as a structure, understood something specific the moment Israel refused that $38 billion. They understood that the central question in U.S.-Israel relations had quietly changed. It is no longer whether America can direct Israeli policy. It is how long Washington can maintain the appearance that it still can. That gap between the appearance of leverage and its reality is where the most consequential decisions of the next decade will be made. History does not close these gaps with announcements. It closes them with a series of quiet moments that accumulate, one by one, into an irreversible fact. Someone had to say it out loud. Now you know.